Hello, welcome to part two. There's a little hiccup in the production. Um, so I think I'm on to my third point of criticism. And this is the problematic use of the dialectic in the work. Um, One of the features of a dialectic is I think there's supposed to be a synthesis at the end, yet his argument kind of precludes any type of resolution. There can't be any synthesis because, well, the Islamic Middle East is in many ways eternal. It has no beginning. It doesn't seem to have an end in this book. There's no chronology for it. There's no change or development. All this leaves us with is this endless crashing um, or clashing of opposites between authority and freedom, between the individual and the state, so on and so forth. Equality and inequality is the motor of this book. Um, and if you characterize a region as it does in this in terms of two opposite concepts, then you have a whole spectrum with which to research it with no limit. You can draw pretty much whatever conclusion you want. Generalization. The book is just full of generalizations, aphorisms, contradictions. When it comes to issues like women in the Islamic Middle East, we don't know whether they're empowered or subjugated. We don't know quite how the individual fits into society because there are so many options available. We don't know whether it's free or unfree, equal or unequal, because ultimately all of these answers are true. We can, with such a broad basis, he can also draw whatever examples he wants to suit his arguments, and he has virtually the whole world at his disposal, or at least quite a lot of the world at his disposal, and most of it's um, centuries and centuries to draw from, if not thousands of years. This brings me on to my concluding remarks. The first question we have to ask is it falsifiable? In general, is history falsifiable is a pretty good question. A lot of social scientists and philosophers would say it isn't. But I think there are ways and methods in history that allow it to be falsified, or at least to be challenged. And I don't think there's any way, if you follow the book's argument, that it could be disproved. It is so broad in scope and method as to completely has a completely totalizing theory, which in many ways cannot be challenged. And it is essentially full of false positives. And false positive is basically if you look long and hard enough at something, or two things, you're bound to find a connection between the two of them. And he seems to have begun with a reading of de Tocqueville's work, dealing with many of the problems of the 19th century. How do you accommodate democracy and liberalism together, and so on and so forth. And it seems in sort of almost backward way to try and work this into the development of Islam, and the issues presented by de Tocqueville I'm not sure are completely compatible. But I think he can't be challenged on this point because, well, there is, as I said, no way to falsify his thesis. The second conclusion is that this is a rather inhuman form of anthropology. The people who are actors in his history are only allowed to represent his ideas. They're only ciphers for the grand overarching culture of the Middle East. There is no possibility of change, no possibility of individual action within this. And as well as condemning people to live within this regime of culture, it also separates the Islamic Middle East from the rest of the world, which I don't think is a particularly good idea, for instance because it ignores the interactions, especially in the borderlands, but also generally because it kind of dehumanizes the people within it. It's a type of Orientalism that I don't think we should really be seeing after the criticism in Edward Said's book. And just to give you one sort of egregious example of it, if we look at what he's talking about love between men and women, and he says this is not just fiction, the burning desire we associate with the Arabs, and he quotes from Massignon. It is not rare for an Arab who has fallen in love to die, for he burns and is consumed body and soul. And I don't think I really have to expand much on that to show that this is kind of a shallow Orientalism, very little, not really in touch with reality, and should not be used in serious academic work unless one's talking about prejudice and Orientalism. But I think this is a serious problem for anthropology in general, in that its emphasis on culture and having these discrete worlds of culture kind of precludes any sort of human activity, or the fact that there are some sort of objective values which are in and of themselves good things, such as the freedom, or a certain freedom from cultural imperatives. I think works that describe this point of view negate certain human qualities, and especially negate freedom. If we look at, say, the work like Amartya Sen and his work on democracy as a historical value, I think that's a good reference point. Or, as was pithily put by Ernst Gellner, this type of work, all it does is prescribe liberalism for the liberals and cannibalism for the cannibals. So my third conclusion is a discussion of what can we take from this. Is anthropology useful for the study of history? And I think it is, but I don't think it's shown. I don't think that this book is a good example of what we can take from anthropology. A central and fundamental problem for the study of history is that it is ahistorical. It is outside the realms of history. There is no change, no development, no progression. I use progression to mean change rather than that there's some goal in which we're trying to reach. But essentially, there's no chronology. This culture exists out of time and is not affected by time. But it does, in some places, point at possible avenues of research. In particular, I like to cite the example where he has of the bloody sheet that comes from the marital bed after the first night in which the couple is together, and is flown like a banner above the house as a representation of various things, the links between the families, the pride the woman takes for maintaining her virginity up until that point, so on and so forth. And this is the type of example of how a small little seed of insight, of actions, where you begin to understand how a culture interacts. But it has to be stressed that this is limited both in where the actual tradition takes place. It's limited in the time it takes place, and we have to accept that even though actions may be similar in different places, they may have different meanings. He doesn't go into this in any great detail. But essentially what I want to say with this is that it has to be that research on these lines has to be humble and limited, and that instead of working from some great overarching framework, we have to start small and build up the world from this very small seed. And its application is also limited to this particular instance. And good examples are these mainly come from Western European history, particularly France with the return of Martin Guerre and also Montaigne. But there is one book on the reading list, Carlo Ginzburg's The Cheese and the Worms. There's also an excellent example of what is called microhistory, which I think is the best way to bring anthropology into the study of history. But in terms of the overarching framework, it brings me back to the early 20th century, to a historian called Toynbee, and his debate and arguments with another historian, the great Dutch historian Peter Gale. And Toynbee proposed a very schematic system of world history, where you had these cultures or civilizations that are characterized by challenge and response, and you had to succeed the challenge in order to become a civilization. So, for example, there were 8 civilizations in Europe, and each had challenge and response, and failed, and collapsed. It was a very dogmatic form of history, and he managed to squeeze the whole world into this. And this was a shocking example of how not to do history to Gale. And Gale said that such a trampling of theory upon historical fact was essentially violence under history. It negated some of the beauty, the complexity of human relations throughout the past, and that we always have to be respectful of this, and we can't just drag theories and mine history for